Anthem was BioWare's first and final attempt at a live service game. The game flopped harder than even most people had anticipated. Critically, it reviewed terribly, scoring just a 59 on Metacritic. For the sake of comparison, Redfall did receive a 56. It was panned for its repetitive mission design, terrible loot system, bare bones endgame, and the need for an always online connection. All this led to the eventual cancellation of what was a huge rework of the game, dubbed Anthem 2.0. Personally, I bought and played Anthem on its initial release, and wrapped up my time with it within a week, only ever revisiting when there were large updates made. It's been a little over 5 years since its release, and while I know there haven't been any updates to the game whatsoever for quite some time now, I want to revisit Anthem. Now, story-wise, Anthem is okay. The game would definitely not win any awards for its narrative or its writing, but its world building and central plot are good enough. The setup is quite predictable, as an evil force attacks a city in order to harness the power of creation. It inevitably goes wrong, and a lot of people are left dead, and the city is completely eviscerated. While the plot really hardly ever throws any twists outside of the most predictable one, I felt that overall BioWare did a good job with the world building, as they always tend to do. Now, this game, of course, doesn't hold a candle to BioWare's best. The days of the Mass Effect series are long gone, and this version of BioWare did not even remotely reach the standard that those games had set for player freedom and agency. Anthem's story is linear. There is no freedom to choose from a faction, make an impactful decision, or change the outcome of the story in any way, shape, or form. I normally wouldn't criticize a game for its lack of choice, but given the studio and its past, its lack of any sort of choice was surprising. Anthem's story is on a set path, and it doesn't diverge from it at all. To give a brief summary, in it you play the role of a freelancer. You quite literally have no name, and to start out, you and your team of freelancers descend into what's called the Heart of Rage, which is basically a cataclysmic light storm that is causing all sorts of death and destruction. Overwhelmed by the intense storm, you and your fellow freelancers are ordered to retreat. With how terribly the mission at the Heart of Rage went, freelancers both lose their reputation and are really no longer counted on. Following these events, 2 years later, you become nothing more than a mercenary who takes on contracts as they come. However, not long after the first mission concludes, you meet an NPC who offers a contract that would require your specific skills and expertise. This sets in motion the rest of the events of Anthem's story. As I mentioned, the story doesn't do anything that sets it apart. There aren't really any emotional moments to draw on, and honestly, nothing really impactful even happens throughout. Moving on to gameplay, Anthem offers a bevy of customization options, and I am totally being sarcastic. Remember the character creators from Mass Effect Andromeda or Dragon Age Inquisition? Yeah, that's totally stripped away. Have fun picking one of the 15 to 20 generic faces. Sure, it makes sense since you never really see your face anyway outside of a few cutscenes, but still, why even offer the option if they're going to be so bare bones? Anyway, the real customization comes in with what javelin you pick. There is the Colossus, which is more like a tanky class that specializes in being heavily armored and sort of leads the charge in battle. Then there's the Interceptor that specializes in speed and agility. The Storm Javelin that is focused on firepower and can hover around, but it's fairly squishy. And then you finally have the Ranger, which is kind of like the all-around playstyle. Each class can wield really any weapon with some light restrictions. For example, the Colossus cannot wield machine pistols, but gets to use rocket launchers. Outside of that, each class has their own set of abilities. These are activated with the R1 and L1 buttons, as well as an L1 and R1 combo that activates that Javelin's specific support skill. You also have the ultimate ability they can activate, and each Javelin has their own unique ultimate ability. Combat will differ quite a bit depending on the Javelin you pick. Since I was playing as a Storm, most of my time in combat was spent hovering around above the enemies and dropping down lightning bolts. Generally speaking, Anthem's combat and gameplay is very satisfying. Flying around and raining down all sorts of chaos on the battlefield never got old. It really did feel like playing an Iron Man simulator. I did enjoy almost all the combat encounters I was in, outside of a few extra bullet spongy enemies. If there was one real reason I would recommend a playthrough of Anthem, it would be to experience the gameplay for yourself. Even playing the game years later, I was still hooked by the combat. Now, missions in Anthem are extremely repetitive. I kid you not when I say that in the very first mission of the game, you'll get introduced to all the objectives that you'll be doing for the rest of the game. Seriously. You'll either be standing near some amplifier that needs its signal boosted, collecting echoes to drop in some sort of well, or collecting fragments to put in place. That's literally it. There will be some small variations between these, but that's it for around 15 to 20 hours of main story. Enemy-wise, there aren't a huge variety of them either. You have your Scar faction enemies, which have like 3 or 4 different types of enemies. You also have your Dominion forces, they also have 3 or 4 different types. You have Wyverns, Titans, and Ursics, and some other brood-type creatures, but that's it. None of these enemies even really require different strategies. Usually, if you see a glowing spot, just shoot that. Interestingly enough, there's really only one boss fight, and that's at the end of the game. No sub-bosses or anything like that throughout the game, which you kind of expect of a looter, especially in an open world, to have some sub-bosses scattered around. Now, my definition of a boss fight means having the boss's health show across the screen, and outside of the main story, we only ever see that in Strongholds. And Strongholds being large dungeon-type missions that usually involve you and potentially 3 other people, that usually ends in a boss fight. But outside of that, the mission design in this game is incredibly lackluster. Moving on to loot and progression, Anthem's loot has always been a problem, and since day one. I wish I was joking when I say that. The rarity system is what you may see in other looters. You got your common, uncommon, rare, epic, and masterwork rarity. The loot drops 98% of the time are pointless, and most of the time would be a downgrade from what you're already using. Replaying the game, I got back up to around level 15, and even then it was likely I would get dropped uncommon items instead of rares or epics. I know it seems like a benign complaint, but really, think about the fact that this is a looter shooter, and not dropping cool loot effectively just makes the game a shooter with a very tiny bit of looter. The loot treadmill should be a constant thing, progressively getting better and better as I level up, but it never felt that way. I ended up resorting to crafting much of the gear I was using because the loot drops were so comical. The loot drop rates were tweaked often during Anthem's initial release. At times the drops were plentiful and the community was happy, and at other times the loot drops were so scarce and anything of quality was reserved for higher level players. Since the max level in Anthem is 30, that's when you can expect to get the best gear. Still though, there should be a chance to score awesome loot very early on in the game to keep a player engaged. Outside of the loot, there are a few other progression systems, but these mostly align with various factions and the rewards that you can gain from gaining reputation with those factions. There is no skill tree of any kind, as the skills you equip in your loadout are what you use in game, and they can't really be augmented one way or another. The endgame of Anthem at its release was laughable. Unfortunately, all the way up to its final days, it was still bare bones. While every looter's endgame is usually a repeatable set of modes that you can go through time and time again, like for example Diablo's Nightmare Dungeons, Anthem never really had that vertical progression system like that. You can move up in difficulty all the way up to Grandmaster 3 where the loot rewards are higher, but the enemies are substantially tougher. Once you hit that max level of 30, you'll go through and do a rotation of 4 strongholds. 4. And a limited version of this game mode called Echoes of Reality, as well as conjunctions that are found in the open world. That's it. Those same few strongholds is all there is available in the endgame. Sure, there are some additional challenges to take on, but those are finite. It never ceases to amaze me when games that are hyper-focused on loot and the power fantasy don't have a huge endgame involved. Players will always need a bigger challenge to take on the stronger they get. Unfortunately, in Anthem, you'll eventually get to the point where there really isn't any challenge left. Honestly, Anthem deserved better. The gameplay, the movement, the world design, the graphics, they're all top tier. BioWare really excelled in those regards, but fell short on their usual charm that includes a story with a wealth of player choice and a well-written narrative. Regardless, the game was a step in a new direction for the studio. However, the lack of experience with a live service model and a fundamental understanding of what makes the game in the looter genre addicting eventually led to the game's downfall. Anthem 2.0 was supposed to be a rebirth for the game, as the developers were reworking a ton of systems in preparation for what would essentially be a relaunch of the game. But in February of 2021, EA officially pulled the plug on any development work, and Anthem was left in a skeleton state. the game can still be played today, of course, and there are other players out there roaming in free play and maybe even running strongholds together. Personally, I was never able to matchmake with anyone for a stronghold run, but I did see some players in the free play mode. Regardless, there is a huge world in Anthem that BioWare created, one that looks good and plays good, but unfortunately lacks in content and substance. If you've never played Anthem and find it on sale, which these days it's basically like $5, then I'd say give it a shot if you're interested in the genre. Your world obviously won't be rocked by playing the game, but you may enjoy a weekend playthrough of it. I enjoyed my second go around with the game, but I don't think there will be a third.